In the fog-draped hills of Georgia, 1893, a widow remarried to escape loneliness. The town celebrated. The church bells rang. But when the truth emerged from a locked attic room, the celebration turned to screams. This is the story of Margaret Thornwell, a woman who unknowingly married her own son, and the conspiracy that nearly buried the truth forever. What you're about to hear will shake you to your core. Hello, and welcome back to The Truth Fear, the channel where we uncover the darkest, most disturbing stories that history tried to bury. I'm your host, and today we're diving into one of the most chilling cases ever recorded in American history. Before we begin, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to The Truth Fear, hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into the unknown, and if this story affects you the way I think it will, share it with someone who can handle the darkness. Leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from, whether it's London, New York, Los Angeles, Berlin, or anywhere else in the world. Your support keeps this channel alive, and together, we're building a community that refuses to let forgotten horrors stay forgotten. Now, let's step back in time. The year is 1893. Queen Victoria still sits on the British throne. America is recovering from the wounds of the Civil War, still raw 30 years later. In the rural backwoods of northern Georgia, where the Appalachian Mountains cast long shadows over isolated communities, there existed a town so small it barely appeared on maps. The locals called it Thornwell Hollow, named after the family that had settled there generations before. And it's in this forgotten place that our story begins. Margaret Thornwell was born in 1848, the daughter of a Baptist preacher and a midwife. She grew up in a world of strict moral codes, Sunday services that lasted half the day, and an unspoken rule that women existed to serve, obey, and bear children. Margaret was considered beautiful by the standards of her time: pale skin, dark hair that fell in waves down her back, and eyes the color of storm clouds. But beauty, in a place like Thornwell Hollow, was both blessing and curse. At 17, Margaret married Thomas Thornwell, her second cousin, a match arranged by their families to keep property and bloodlines within the clan. This practice was not uncommon in isolated mountain communities where outsiders were viewed with suspicion and family trees tangled back on themselves like the roots of ancient oaks. Thomas was 15 years her senior, a stern man who worked the lumber mill and came home each night smelling of sawdust and sweat. Their marriage was not built on love but on duty, and duty was something Margaret had been taught to accept without question. In 1866, Margaret gave birth to a son. They named him Samuel, after Thomas's father. The boy came into the world during a thunderstorm so violent that the windows rattled in their frames and the midwife swore she saw the devil himself dancing in the lightning. Samuel was a difficult child from the beginning. He cried endlessly, refused his mother's milk, and as he grew, he showed a wildness that no amount of discipline could tame. Thomas beat the boy regularly, believing that the rod would drive out whatever demon possessed him. Margaret could only watch, helpless, as her son learned to fear his father and resent his mother for her silence. When Samuel was 7 years old, something happened that would set the entire tragedy in motion. Thomas Thornwell was working at the mill when a chain snapped. The massive log it had been holding rolled free and crushed him against the machinery. He died instantly, they said, though the men who pulled his broken body from the wreckage told a different story in whispers over whiskey. They said Thomas had been alive for nearly an hour, screaming, begging for death, before blood loss finally silenced him. Margaret became a widow at 25, left alone with a wild, angry child and a small plot of land that barely produced enough to keep them fed. The community, as was customary, offered help at first. Neighbors brought food, helped with repairs, and the church collected a small fund to see her through the winter. But as months turned to years, that charity dried up. Widows were expected to remarry or fade into the background, becoming invisible caretakers for aging parents or unpaid servants in relatives' homes. Margaret had no intention of doing either. She tried to raise Samuel alone, but the boy grew more uncontrollable with each passing year. He killed small animals and left their bodies on the doorstep. He started fires in the woods. He would disappear for days and return filthy, scratched, his eyes holding something that wasn't quite human. The townspeople began to talk. They said the boy was cursed, that the devil had marked him at birth during that terrible storm. Some suggested that Margaret should send him to the state asylum, where children like Samuel were locked away and forgotten. Margaret couldn't bring herself to do it. Whatever Samuel had become, he was still her son, still the baby she had labored to bring into the world during that violent night. But in 1879, when Samuel was 13, the decision was taken out of her hands. The boy attacked a neighbor's daughter, a girl of 10, dragging her into the woods with intent to do unspeakable things. Men from the town formed a hunting party, found Samuel before he could complete his crime, and beat him nearly to death. The sheriff, a friend of Thomas's brother, gave Margaret a choice: commit the boy to the asylum or watch him hang. Samuel was taken away in chains, screaming that his mother had betrayed him, that he would never forgive her, that he would come back and make her pay for what she'd done. Margaret never saw him again. Or so she believed. The asylum where Samuel was sent, the Georgia State Lunatic Asylum in Milledgeville, was a place of horrors that would later be exposed in newspaper investigations. Patients were chained to walls, left in their own filth, subjected to experimental treatments that included ice baths, bloodletting, and crude surgeries performed without anesthesia. The death rate was staggering. Families who committed relatives to that place rarely expected to see them alive again. For Margaret, Samuel's removal brought both relief and crushing guilt. She was free from the daily terror of living with a child she could neither control nor understand, but she was also haunted by the look in his eyes as they dragged him away. She became a ghost in Thornwell Hollow, a woman who went to church but never spoke, who tended her garden but never smiled, who existed in a perpetual state of mourning for a son who was not dead but might as well have been. Years passed. Margaret aged in the way of women who have known too much sorrow. Her dark hair turned grey. Her storm-cloud eyes became distant, focused on things no one else could see. She lived alone in the house where Thomas had died, where Samuel had been born, surrounded by memories that refused to fade. And then, in the spring of 1892, a stranger came to Thornwell Hollow. His name was James Goodwin, or so he claimed. He was a man in his mid-20s, handsome in a rough way, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. He said he was a traveling carpenter, looking for work as he made his way south. The town, always suspicious of outsiders, nevertheless needed someone to repair the church roof, and James proved skilled with his hands. He was quiet, polite, and attended Sunday services without fail. Within weeks, he had been accepted in a way few strangers ever were. James took a particular interest in Margaret Thornwell. He would tip his hat when passing her on the road, offer to help with heavy work around her property, and sit beside her in church even though other pews had space. Margaret, starved for kindness after years of isolation, found herself drawn to this gentle man who seemed to see her not as a cursed widow but as a woman worthy of attention. Their courtship, if it could be called that, was brief. James proposed marriage in the autumn of 1892, and Margaret, lonely beyond measure and tired of living half a life, accepted. The wedding took place in November, a small ceremony at the Thornwell Hollow Baptist Church. The townspeople attended, grateful to see the widow finally moving forward, finally leaving the past behind. They had no idea what they were celebrating. The marriage seemed happy at first. James moved into Margaret's house, brought in firewood before winter struck, made repairs that had gone undone for years. Margaret felt something she hadn't felt since before Samuel was born: hope. She dared to believe that perhaps God had not abandoned her, that perhaps she deserved happiness after all. But as winter deepened and the world outside grew dark by mid-afternoon, strange things began to happen. Margaret noticed that James would sometimes stare at her with an expression she couldn't quite identify. Not love, not desire, but something else. Something that made her skin crawl even as she told herself she was imagining things. He knew details about the house that she had never told him, could navigate the rooms in complete darkness as if he had lived there all his life. He knew where Thomas's tools were kept, knew which floorboards creaked, knew that the third step on the stairs was loose and should be avoided. When Margaret asked how he knew these things, James would smile and say he was observant, that he paid attention to details. But the smile never reached his eyes. Then there were the nightmares. Margaret began to dream of Samuel, not as the child who had been taken away but as a man, standing at the foot of her bed, watching her with hatred so pure it was almost tangible. She would wake gasping, reaching for James, only to find his side of the bed empty. She would find him standing at the window, staring out at the darkness, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been something else entirely. In February of 1893, a traveling preacher passed through Thornwell Hollow. This man, Reverend Josiah Black, was known throughout Georgia as a firebrand, a man who preached hellfire and damnation with such fervor that hardened sinners fell to their knees weeping. He held a revival meeting in the town, and Margaret attended with James. During the service, Reverend Black suddenly stopped mid-sermon. He stared directly at James Goodwin, his face going pale, his hands beginning to shake. The church fell silent. And then the Reverend spoke words that would echo through the decades to come. "There is one among us who lives in sin so great, so unholy, that the very ground rejects his footsteps. One who has violated the sacred laws that even beasts do not break. Reveal yourself before God strikes you down where you sit." James stood slowly. He looked at the Reverend, then at Margaret, and then he began to laugh. It was not the laugh of a man, but something else, something with too many layers, too many voices. He walked out of the church, and Margaret, confused and frightened, followed him. That night, James locked himself in the attic, a room that Margaret never used because it had been Samuel's room, left untouched since the day he was taken away. She could hear him moving around up there, dragging something heavy, talking to himself in a voice that rose and fell like a twisted lullaby. She pressed her ear to the door and heard words that made her blood freeze. "Mother knew. Mother always knew. Mother let them take me, but now Mother has taken me back. Now Mother is mine." Margaret stumbled away from the door, her mind refusing to accept what her heart already understood. She ran through the dark house to the small chest where she kept precious items, documents, the few photographs she owned. With shaking hands, she pulled out a daguerreotype taken of Samuel when he was 12, just months before the incident that led to his commitment. She held it next to the photograph from her wedding day, the one that showed James Goodwin standing beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his face turned slightly toward the camera. They were the same person. The same dark hair. The same eyes that looked through rather than at. The same small scar above the left eyebrow, earned when Samuel had fallen from a tree at age 8. The same slightly crooked smile that she had once thought was charming in her new husband but now recognized as the same smile her son had worn when he brought her dead birds as gifts. Margaret's scream echoed through the hollow. The asylum. The records. The death certificate that was supposed to have arrived but never did. The officials who said Samuel had died of fever in 1885 and had been buried in the asylum's potter's field. It had all been lies, or mistakes, or something worse. Somehow, Samuel had escaped or been released. Somehow, he had made his way back to Thornwell Hollow. Somehow, he had courted and married his own mother, and she had never known. Margaret ran from the house into the winter night, barefoot, still in her nightgown, the photographs clutched in her hands. She ran to the nearest neighbor, pounded on the door, screaming about James, about Samuel, about the unspeakable thing that had happened. The neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Kettering, took one look at Margaret's face and knew that whatever she was saying was true. Within an hour, half the town had gathered at Margaret's house. The men, armed with rifles and the righteous fury of people confronting an evil they could barely comprehend, broke down the attic door. The room they found was a shrine to madness. The walls were covered in writing, scratched into the wood with what must have been fingernails or a knife. The same phrases repeated over and over: "Mother is mine. Mother left me. Mother will pay. Mother will love me. Mother is mine. Mother is mine. Mother is mine." In the center of the room sat James Goodwin, or Samuel Thornwell, or whatever he had become. He was naked, covered in his own filth, rocking back and forth, his eyes unfocused. Around his neck hung a locket that Margaret recognized. It was the one she had given Samuel on his 7th birthday, the one she thought had been lost. Inside was a tiny painting of her face, done when she was young and still beautiful. When the men grabbed him, Samuel did not fight. He only turned his head and looked down at the crowd gathering outside, searching until he found Margaret standing in the yard, Mrs. Kettering's arms wrapped around her to keep her upright. "Mother," Samuel said, his voice eerily calm, eerily childlike. "Why did you leave me in the dark place? Why did you let them hurt me? I only wanted to come home. I only wanted you to love me the way a mother should." The horror of those words, the implication beneath them, was too much for the assembled crowd. Men who had fought in the war, who had seen death and dealt it out, turned away unable to meet each other's eyes. Women wept. And Margaret collapsed, her mind fracturing under the weight of what she had unknowingly done. The authorities were summoned from the county seat. The sheriff, a different man from the one who had taken Samuel away 14 years earlier, listened to the testimony of the townspeople and examined the evidence. The photographs. The writings on the walls. The records that showed James Goodwin had never existed before 1892. And most damningly, the records from the asylum. It turned out that Samuel Thornwell had not died in 1885. That death certificate had been for a different patient, a clerical error that was all too common in the chaotic, understaffed asylum. Samuel had been released in 1891, deemed cured by a doctor who spent less than 5 minutes examining him. The boy who had gone into the asylum had come out a man, transformed by years of abuse and neglect into something that could pass as normal if you didn't look too closely. But Samuel had not been cured. He had simply learned to hide what he was. He had spent a year planning, researching, discovering that his mother still lived in Thornwell Hollow, still alone, still vulnerable. He had created a new identity, traveled back to the one place he remembered, and executed a revenge so twisted that even now, more than a century later, it defies complete understanding. Did he know from the beginning that he was marrying his mother? Or did the recognition come later, the realization dawning slowly as he lived in the house of his childhood, slept in his dead father's bed, touched the woman who had given him life? The truth died with him, if truth is even the right word for something so far beyond normal human understanding. Samuel was arrested and taken back to the asylum, but this time to the criminal ward, where the most dangerous patients were kept in solitary confinement. He lived for 3 more years, never speaking another word, never acknowledging the guards or doctors who tried to examine him. In 1896, he was found dead in his cell, hanging from a noose made of torn strips of his own clothing. The official verdict was suicide, but some of the guards whispered that his body showed signs of a struggle, that perhaps other inmates had gotten to him, dispensing the rough justice that the system could not. Margaret Thornwell never recovered from the revelation. The church and community that had once supported her now shunned her, not out of cruelty but out of an inability to reconcile what had happened with their understanding of God's plan. How could a mother unknowingly marry her own son? What kind of God would allow such an abomination? The questions had no answers, and so it was easier to pretend Margaret didn't exist. She lived alone in her house for 2 more years, rarely seen, rarely spoken to. Those who did see her reported that she had aged decades in months, that her hair had gone completely white, that she talked to herself constantly, arguing with voices no one else could hear. In the spring of 1895, Margaret was found dead in her bed, her hands folded across her chest, her eyes open and staring at the ceiling. The doctor listed the cause of death as heart failure, but everyone knew the truth. Margaret Thornwell had died of shame, of guilt, of a knowledge so terrible that her body simply gave up rather than continue carrying it. The house stood empty for years. No one would buy it, no one would even go near it. Children dared each other to touch the front door, but no one ever accepted the dare. The townspeople said it was cursed, that on certain nights you could hear screams coming from within, that shadows moved in the windows even though no one lived there. In 1910, the house burned down under mysterious circumstances. Some said lightning struck it during a storm, others said that someone finally decided to cleanse the land of its taint. The truth, like so much about this story, remains unknown. Thornwell Hollow itself began to die after the scandal. Young people moved away, unwilling to live in a place with such darkness in its history. By 1920, the town was largely abandoned. By 1950, it had vanished completely, reclaimed by the forest, leaving only foundations and a cemetery where stone markers bear the names of people that history has forgotten. But the story didn't end there. It couldn't end there. Stories like this have a life of their own, spreading through whispers and warnings, taking on new details with each telling. The case file, such as it was, disappeared from county records sometime in the 1930s, allegedly destroyed in a fire but more likely removed by officials who wanted to erase this stain on Georgia's history. The few newspaper accounts that mentioned it at all were vague, referring only to an unfortunate incident of moral confusion, without providing details. For decades, the story existed only as rumor, as folklore, as the kind of tale that people told around campfires to frighten each other. Most people assumed it was fiction, a Gothic horror story invented to teach moral lessons about sin and its consequences. But in 1967, a graduate student researching the history of mental institutions in the South discovered a letter in the archives of the Georgia State University Library. The letter was written by Reverend Josiah Black, the traveling preacher who had been present at the church service when the truth began to unravel. Dated March 1893, just weeks after Samuel's arrest, the letter was addressed to a colleague and described the events in Thornwell Hollow in detail. Reverend Black wrote that he had been haunted by what he witnessed, that he had prayed for guidance on whether to speak publicly about the case or let it fade into obscurity. In the end, he chose silence, believing that some truths do more harm than good. But he kept his own record, and that record survived. The graduate student published a paper based on the letter, bringing the case back into public awareness. Other researchers began digging, finding small mentions in church records, asylum logs, and personal diaries. Piece by piece, the story of Margaret and Samuel Thornwell emerged from the darkness where it had been buried for nearly a century. Modern psychologists and criminologists who have studied the case offer various theories about what really happened. Some suggest that Samuel suffered from a severe attachment disorder compounded by the trauma of his institutionalization, that his obsession with his mother represented not sexual desire but a twisted attempt to reclaim the childhood that had been stolen from him. Others argue that prolonged abuse in the asylum, possibly including sexual abuse, damaged Samuel's understanding of normal relationships and boundaries, leading him to blur the lines between familial love and romantic love. There are also darker theories, ones that suggest Samuel knew exactly what he was doing from the very beginning, that his courtship of Margaret was a calculated act of revenge for her perceived betrayal when she had him committed. By making her complicit, even unknowingly, in an act of incest, he destroyed her as thoroughly as if he had killed her with his own hands. This theory is supported by the writings found in the attic, which showed a level of planning and awareness inconsistent with someone acting purely on confused impulse. We will never know for certain what went through Samuel's mind during those months when he lived as James Goodwin, husband to the woman who had given birth to him. We can only look at the evidence and feel the same horror that the people of Thornwell Hollow felt when the truth was revealed. What we do know is that this case represents one of the most disturbing examples of how trauma, isolation, and systemic failure can combine to create unspeakable tragedy. Margaret was a victim of her time, trapped in a world that gave women few choices and less support. Samuel was a victim of a mental health system that treated patients as less than human, that locked away children and subjected them to torments that would break any mind. And both were victims of a community that preferred silence and secrecy to confronting uncomfortable truths. The case raises questions that remain relevant today. How do we identify and help troubled children before they become dangerous adults? How do we balance the rights of individuals with the safety of communities? How do we deal with mental illness in ways that heal rather than harm? And perhaps most disturbingly, how do we cope with the knowledge that sometimes, despite our best efforts or perhaps because of our worst failures, evil finds a way to flourish in the spaces between our certainties? The story of Margaret and Samuel Thornwell has been retold countless times since that graduate student's paper in 1967. It has been the subject of academic studies, true crime books, and even a controversial television documentary in the 1990s that many criticized as exploitative. Each retelling adds new interpretations, new theories, new attempts to make sense of something that may be fundamentally senseless. But what often gets lost in these retellings is the human element. Margaret was not just a figure in a horror story. She was a real woman who loved her son despite his troubles, who made an impossible choice when faced with his violence, who paid for that choice in ways she could never have imagined. Samuel was not just a monster. He was a child failed by every system meant to protect him, transformed by abuse into something terrible. There is no moral to this story, no lesson that makes it easier to digest. There is only the raw fact of what happened, the knowledge that such things are possible, and the understanding that the line between victim and perpetrator can sometimes blur beyond recognition. In Thornwell Hollow, where the town once stood, there is now only forest. The graves in the cemetery are overgrown, the names on the stones worn smooth by weather and time. No historical marker indicates what happened there. No plaque commemorates the lives destroyed by a tragedy that was equal parts Greek drama and Gothic horror. The state of Georgia would prefer to forget, and perhaps that's understandable. Some stories are too dark to be part of an official heritage. But forgotten or not, the story persists. It persists because it touches something deep in the human psyche, some primal fear of the family unit twisted into something unrecognizable. It persists because it reminds us that the monsters we fear are not always strangers lurking in shadows, but sometimes wear familiar faces, sometimes come from within our own homes. And it persists because truth, no matter how terrible, has a way of refusing to stay buried. Like Samuel clawing his way out of the asylum and back to Thornwell Hollow, like Margaret's screams echoing through that winter night, the truth demands to be heard even when we would rather cover our ears and pretend it doesn't exist. So what really happened in Thornwell Hollow in 1893? A widow remarried. A son came home. And the collision between those two facts created a wound in reality that has never fully healed. That's the truth. That's the fear. And that's why we remember, even when remembering hurts. Some historians have attempted to verify every detail of this case, and they hit walls at every turn. Records that should exist don't. Records that do exist contradict each other. The fire that destroyed the county courthouse in 1932 was blamed for the loss of many documents, but some researchers believe that certain files were removed before the fire, deliberately hidden by officials who wanted this scandal erased from history. What cannot be disputed is that the case had ripple effects throughout Georgia and beyond. The scandal contributed to reform efforts at the Georgia State Lunatic Asylum, though those reforms came too late to help Samuel or the thousands of other patients who suffered there. It also sparked discussions about how communities handle mentally ill individuals, though again, these discussions led to little immediate change. The case also entered into local folklore in ways both expected and strange. In the decades after the tragedy, mothers in rural Georgia would warn misbehaving children, "Be good, or you'll end up like the Thornwell boy." The name became synonymous with cautionary tales about what happens when children are not properly disciplined, though this interpretation misses the point entirely. Samuel wasn't evil because he lacked discipline. He was destroyed by a system that saw him as a problem to be locked away rather than a child who needed help. There are also persistent rumors, never confirmed, that other cases similar to the Thornwell tragedy occurred in isolated communities throughout the American South during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The combination of poverty, geographic isolation, limited record keeping, and the stigma surrounding mental illness created conditions where such cases could occur and be covered up. If these rumors are true, and there is some circumstantial evidence to suggest they might be, then Margaret and Samuel's story is not unique but rather the one example that happened to be documented and couldn't be completely suppressed. This possibility makes the case even more disturbing. How many other widows unknowingly remarried their own children? How many other young men, released from asylums with inadequate records and no follow-up care, returned to their communities under false identities? How many other towns decided that silence was preferable to scandal, that protecting their reputation mattered more than confronting truth? We will never know the full answer to these questions, but the fact that we must ask them at all speaks to systematic failures that extended far beyond one town in Georgia. Let's talk about the conspiracy aspect of this case, because that element is often overlooked in the rush to focus on the sensational details of incest. When Samuel was committed to the asylum in 1879, he was 13 years old. When he was released in 1891, he was 25. 12 years in that hellish institution should have left extensive records, intake documents, medical evaluations, incident reports, treatment notes, and finally, a release evaluation. Yet when authorities tried to investigate how Samuel had been released and why no one had notified his family, they found almost nothing. The official explanation was incompetence and poor record keeping, and certainly the asylum was notorious for both. But some researchers have suggested something more sinister, that Samuel's release was facilitated by individuals who knew exactly who he was and what he might do. The theory goes that certain staff members at the asylum, either out of cruelty or a twisted sense of curiosity, deliberately helped Samuel create a false identity and pointed him toward Thornwell Hollow, wanting to see what would happen. Is this theory true? There's no hard evidence, only suspicious gaps in documentation and the testimony of former asylum workers who claimed that patients were sometimes released as part of informal experiments to see if they could reintegrate into society. If Samuel was part of such an experiment, it failed catastrophically, but more importantly, it represents an ethical violation so profound that those responsible would have every reason to destroy evidence. The conspiracy, if it existed, didn't end with Samuel's release. When the scandal broke in 1893, authorities moved quickly to control the narrative. Newspaper editors in Atlanta and other Georgia cities received visits from state officials who strongly suggested that detailed coverage of the case would be unwise. The message was clear: this story makes Georgia look bad, makes our institutions look bad, and it's in everyone's best interest if it just goes away. And largely, it did go away. The few news accounts that exist are brief and euphemistic. The official records vanished. And the town itself was allowed to fade from existence, taking its secrets with it. This wasn't accidental. This was a coordinated effort to bury a truth that was too uncomfortable, too damaging, too revealing of systematic rot that extended far beyond one tragic case. The people of Thornwell Hollow were complicit in this conspiracy of silence, but can we really blame them? They were poor, isolated, and powerless. They had just witnessed something that shattered their understanding of morality and divine order. When officials told them it was best to forget, to move on, to never speak of it again, they agreed because what else could they do? They couldn't undo what had happened. They couldn't bring Margaret back to sanity or Samuel back to innocence. All they could do was try to protect themselves from further contamination by that evil. But silence has its own cost. By refusing to confront what happened, by treating it as an aberration rather than a symptom of deeper problems, the community ensured that the conditions that created the tragedy would persist. Other troubled children would be locked away without adequate care. Other families would be torn apart by decisions made in desperation. Other towns would face their own versions of the Thornwell case and would choose silence for the same reasons. This brings us to the question that haunts anyone who studies this case: could it happen again? Could a mother unknowingly marry her own child in the modern era? The answer is both comforting and disturbing. On one hand, we have better records, better identification systems, better mental health care, and better communication between institutions. On the other hand, we still have homeless populations, people who live off the grid, individuals who fall through bureaucratic cracks, and families torn apart by circumstances. In the chaos of modern life, especially among marginalized communities, it is not impossible to imagine scenarios where family members lose track of each other, where records are inadequate or destroyed, where someone could return under a different identity. It would be harder than it was in 1893, but not impossible. And that should frighten us. The case of Margaret and Samuel Thornwell stands as a monument to human suffering, systematic failure, and the terrible things that can happen when we prioritize convenience over truth, reputation over justice, and silence over acknowledgement. It's a case that cannot be neatly resolved or explained away. It simply exists, dark and immovable, refusing to be forgotten no matter how many decades pass. When I researched this case, I traveled to the area where Thornwell Hollow once stood. The forest there is thick and unwelcoming, full of brambles and poison ivy, as if nature itself is trying to keep people away. I found the cemetery eventually, though it took hours of searching. The stones are crumbling, covered in moss, many of them unreadable. I found Margaret's grave, a simple marker that gives only her name and dates: Margaret Thornwell, 1848 to 1895. Standing there, in that quiet place where even birds seem reluctant to sing, I try to imagine what Margaret's life was like. The hopes she must have had as a young woman, the terror she must have felt living with an unstable child, the loneliness of widowhood, and the brief happiness she found with James Goodwin before learning the unspeakable truth. I tried to imagine the moment of recognition, the moment when she understood what had happened, and I couldn't. The human mind has limits to what it can comprehend, and perhaps that's a mercy. I looked for Samuel's grave too, but I couldn't find it. If he's buried in that cemetery, his marker has been destroyed or was never erected in the first place. More likely, he's buried in the potter's field at the asylum, in an unmarked grave among hundreds of other forgotten souls. That seems appropriate somehow. Samuel existed between identities, between relationships, between sanity and madness. Why should his final resting place be any different? As I stood in that cemetery, I thought about all the unanswered questions that this case raises. Did Margaret, on some unconscious level, recognize her son? Did some maternal instinct try to warn her that James Goodwin was not who he claimed to be? Or was the disguise, both physical and psychological, so complete that even the woman who gave birth to him couldn't see through it? And what about the people of Thornwell Hollow? How many of them suspected something was wrong before the truth came out? James Goodwin knew too much, moved too comfortably through Margaret's house, seemed too interested in this particular widow. Did anyone notice? Did anyone question? Or did they, like Margaret, want so badly to believe in the possibility of happiness that they ignored the signs? These questions have no answers, only speculations that lead to more questions. And perhaps that's the real horror of the Thornwell case. It's not just what happened, but what it reveals about how fragile our certainties are, how easily deception can flourish, how the things we think we know can turn out to be terribly, catastrophically wrong. Before I left the cemetery, I noticed something odd. On Margaret's gravestone, someone had recently left flowers. They were fresh, placed there within the past day or two. I looked around, but the forest was empty, silent. Who would leave flowers on the grave of a woman who died more than a century ago, in a cemetery that barely anyone can find? I'd like to think it was a descendant of Margaret's family, someone who had learned her story and wanted to honor her memory with a gesture of compassion. But another part of me, the part that has spent too long studying dark history, wonders if it was something else. A historian, perhaps. A curiosity seeker. Or maybe someone who understands what Margaret went through, someone who knows what it's like to be destroyed by circumstances beyond their control, and wanted to acknowledge that pain across the span of more than 100 years. Or maybe, and this is the thought that stayed with me as I drove away from that place, maybe there are still secrets about this case that haven't been uncovered, still connections to the present day that we don't understand. Maybe the story of Thornwell Hollow isn't as finished as we think. That's the nature of true horror. It doesn't end neatly. It doesn't resolve. It lingers, like the smell of smoke from a fire long extinguished, like the echo of a scream in an empty house, like flowers on a grave in a cemetery that time forgot. So what have we learned from the case of Margaret and Samuel Thornwell? What wisdom can we extract from this darkness? Perhaps the most important lesson is this: evil is rarely a simple thing. We want our villains to be obvious, our victims to be blameless, our moral lines to be clear. But reality doesn't work that way. Samuel Thornwell was both victim and perpetrator. He was an abused child who became an abuser. He was failed by every system that should have protected him, and then he used that failure as justification to commit an act of such profound violation that it defies categorization. Margaret, too, exists in a moral gray area that makes us uncomfortable. She was a victim of her son's deception, yes, but she was also the mother who allowed him to be taken to a place of unspeakable horror. Did she have a choice? In the context of her time and circumstances, probably not. But that doesn't erase the fact that her decision, however necessary it seemed, set in motion the chain of events that led to tragedy. And what about the community of Thornwell Hollow? They were victims of scandal, their town's name forever tainted by association with this case. But they were also complicit in the conspiracy of silence that allowed the truth to be buried. They chose reputation over justice, comfort over confrontation. Can we blame them for that? Perhaps not. But we can recognize that their choice had consequences, that by refusing to face what happened, they ensured it would never be properly understood or prevented from happening again. This moral complexity is what makes the Thornwell case more than just a sensational story of incest and madness. It's a mirror held up to society, reflecting back all our failures, all our hypocrisies, all the ways we choose convenient lies over difficult truths. And that reflection is still relevant today, more than 130 years after Margaret discovered the identity of the man she had married. Let's consider the modern parallels. We still have inadequate mental health systems that warehouse troubled individuals rather than treating them. We still have bureaucratic failures that allow people to fall through cracks. We still have communities that prioritize their image over confronting uncomfortable realities. We still have families torn apart by circumstances, by poverty, by the impossibility of caring for those who need more help than we know how to give. The specific circumstances of the Thornwell case may be unique, but the underlying failures that made it possible are not. They persist, mutating to fit new contexts but remaining fundamentally the same. How many modern families struggle with mentally ill children, desperate for help but unable to afford treatment or access services? How many people are released from institutions with inadequate preparation or follow-up, set loose to either succeed or fail on their own? How many communities deal with scandal by hiding it rather than learning from it? The Thornwell case asks us to confront these questions, and it doesn't offer easy answers because there are no easy answers. All we can do is acknowledge the complexity, resist the urge to simplify or sensationalize, and try to build systems that are more humane, more effective, more honest than the ones that failed Margaret and Samuel so catastrophically. There's another aspect of this case that deserves attention, the role of isolation in creating the conditions for tragedy. Thornwell Hollow was not just geographically isolated but culturally and economically isolated as well. It was a place where outside authorities rarely ventured, where the church and family structures held absolute power, where questioning was discouraged and conformity was enforced. In such environments, abuse can flourish unchecked. Mental illness can go unrecognized or be attributed to moral failing or demonic possession. And when tragedy strikes, the instinct is to circle wagons, protect the tribe, keep outsiders from judging. This pattern repeats throughout history and across cultures. Isolated communities, whether in rural mountains or urban enclaves or religious compounds, tend to handle their problems internally, often with devastating results. The internet and modern communication have reduced geographic isolation, but they've also created new forms of isolation. Online communities can be just as closed and self-reinforcing as Thornwell Hollow ever was. Conspiracy theories flourish. Dangerous ideologies spread. And when people exist entirely within echo chambers that reinforce their existing beliefs, they become unreachable, unfixable, until something terrible happens and the rest of the world is forced to notice. Samuel Thornwell spent 12 years isolated in an asylum, cut off from normal human contact, subjected to abuse that would warp anyone's psychology. Is it any wonder he emerged as something monstrous? And yet we continue to isolate people, whether in prisons or psychiatric facilities or simply through social and economic marginalization, and then we express shock when isolation produces predictable results. If the Thornwell case teaches us anything, it should teach us that isolation is dangerous. Not being alone, which can be healing and necessary, but being cut off from meaningful connection, from accountability, from the checks and balances that help maintain our humanity. Samuel was isolated in the asylum. Margaret was isolated in her widowhood. Thornwell Hollow was isolated from the broader world. And in those isolated spaces, horror grew unchecked until it burst forth in a way that couldn't be ignored. Now, I want to address something that I've been dancing around, something that makes this case particularly difficult to discuss in the modern era, the question of consent and victimhood when it comes to the marriage itself. Margaret did not know she was marrying her son. She could not have consented to incest because she didn't know it was happening. In every meaningful sense, she was a victim of Samuel's deception. But the physical acts that occurred within that marriage, the intimacy that Margaret presumably entered into willingly, believing she was with her husband, takes on a different character when we know the truth. This creates a paradox that our moral frameworks struggle to address. Margaret was raped by deception, repeatedly, over months. But she didn't know it at the time. Does that knowledge retroactively change the nature of her experience? How do we categorize a violation that the victim didn't recognize as such until after the fact? Modern discussions of consent would clearly define what happened to Margaret as assault. She did not have accurate information about who she was consenting to be intimate with, therefore her consent was invalid. But in 1893, such concepts didn't exist in any formal sense. Margaret would have understood what happened to her as defilement, as sin, as contamination. She would have felt the violation in spiritual rather than legal terms. This is important because it helps explain why Margaret died so soon after the revelation. It wasn't just shame, though shame certainly played a role. It was the complete destruction of her reality. Everything she thought she knew about her life, her marriage, her choices, was revealed to be a lie built on an unspeakable foundation. The very ground beneath her feet had been pulled away, leaving her falling through darkness with nothing to hold onto. In modern terms, we might say Margaret experienced a catastrophic psychological trauma that her mind simply couldn't process. In the language of her time, they said her spirit was broken, that she lost the will to live. Both descriptions point to the same truth: what happened to Margaret Thornwell was so far beyond normal human experience that survival became impossible. And what of Samuel's mental state during the marriage? This is perhaps the most disturbing question of all. Was he experiencing what he believed to be genuine love for his mother, unable to distinguish between different types of affection? Was he knowingly punishing her, taking satisfaction in each moment of intimacy as another twist of the knife? Or was his psychology so fractured that he was simultaneously playing multiple roles, James Goodwin the husband and Samuel Thornwell the son, perhaps not even fully aware that these identities had collapsed into one? The writings found in the attic suggest elements of all three possibilities. There were declarations of love that could be read as either romantic or childish attachment. There were statements of anger and revenge. And there were passages that seemed to reflect genuine confusion about identity and relationship. Samuel's mind, after 12 years of abuse and isolation, had become a labyrinth where normal categories no longer applied. This is what makes Samuel simultaneously sympathetic and horrifying. We can understand how he became what he was, can trace the path from troubled child to institutionalized adolescent to traumatized adult. But understanding doesn't erase the fact that he chose, on some level, to inflict tremendous suffering on the one person who had tried, however imperfectly, to help him. Or did he choose? This is where we venture into philosophical territory that has no clear answers. At what point does mental illness or trauma remove moral culpability? At what point do we say that someone's actions, however harmful, are not truly their fault because they lack the capacity for genuine choice? The law in 1893 had little nuance on these matters. Samuel was deemed legally insane and returned to the asylum, but there was no attempt to understand his psychology or provide actual treatment. He was simply locked away until death released him. Modern justice might handle the case differently, might attempt rehabilitation or at least detailed psychiatric evaluation. But would that really change anything? Would we be any better equipped to deal with someone whose psychology had been so thoroughly shattered? These are uncomfortable questions, and I raise them not because I have answers but because the Thornwell case forces us to confront the limits of our moral and legal frameworks. There are situations that simply don't fit into our categories, that resist easy judgment, that leave us grasping for language adequate to describe what happened. Let me share something else I discovered during my research, something that hasn't been widely reported. In the Georgia State University archives, there's a collection of letters written by various residents of Thornwell Hollow in the years following the scandal. These letters, mostly addressed to relatives who had moved away, provide a window into how the community processed what happened. One letter, written by Mrs. Kettering, the neighbor who took Margaret in the night she discovered the truth, is particularly revealing. Mrs. Kettering writes about how the town changed after the scandal, how neighbors who had lived peacefully together for decades began to eye each other with suspicion, how families started keeping secrets, how the social fabric that had held the community together simply unraveled. She describes finding Margaret's body that spring morning in 1895, how peaceful she looked, as if death had been a relief. But Mrs. Kettering also mentions something that other accounts don't include. She says that when they were preparing Margaret's body for burial, they found marks on her wrists and ankles, old scars that suggested she had been restrained at some point. Whether these were from something that happened during her marriage to James, or from something else entirely, Mrs. Kettering doesn't say. But she mentions them, and then she writes, "I think there was more to the story than we knew." I think there were things that happened in that house that will go with Margaret to her grave. What did Mrs. Kettering suspect? What additional horrors might have occurred behind the closed doors of Margaret's house during those months of the marriage? We'll never know, but the suggestion that the public scandal was only part of the story adds yet another layer of darkness to an already dark tale. Another letter, this one from the town's schoolteacher, mentions that in the months after Samuel's arrest, several other families in Thornwell Hollow suddenly left town without explanation. The teacher speculates that these families had their own secrets, their own fears about what might be revealed if authorities started looking too closely at the community. Whether these secrets were related to the Thornwell case or were simply the normal collection of scandals and indiscretions that every town accumulates, we don't know. But the implication is that Thornwell Hollow was not the innocent, God-fearing community it pretended to be. This shouldn't surprise us. Isolated communities often develop their own norms and practices that outsiders would find disturbing. Inbreeding was common in mountain communities like Thornwell Hollow, not necessarily because people desired it but because the pool of potential marriage partners was limited. This created genetic problems that were often attributed to curses or bad blood. It also created a culture where certain types of family relationships were viewed differently than they would be in broader society. I'm not suggesting that the community condoned what Samuel did, clearly they were horrified. But I am suggesting that the rigid boundaries we imagine existing in the past may have been more flexible than we'd like to think. And that flexibility, that moral ambiguity, may have contributed to an environment where Samuel's deception could succeed for as long as it did. There's also the question of complicity. Did anyone in Thornwell Hollow know or suspect James Goodwin's true identity before Reverend Black's dramatic revelation? The official story is that no one knew, that everyone was shocked. But human nature suggests otherwise. Small towns are not places where secrets are easily kept. People notice things, whisper things, suspect things. It's possible, even likely, that some people in Thornwell Hollow noticed the similarities between James Goodwin and the boy who had been taken away 14 years earlier. But noticing and acting on what you notice are two different things. If you suspected that the carpenter who had come to town was actually Margaret Thornwell's son, what would you do? Would you speak up, risking being wrong and causing scandal? Or would you stay silent, telling yourself you must be mistaken, that it couldn't possibly be true? And if you did suspect, if you had doubts, how would you feel when the truth came out? Would you blame yourself for not saying something? Would you justify your silence? Would you join in the collective amnesia that descended on Thornwell Hollow, pretending you never suspected anything at all? This is the insidious nature of complicity. It's not usually an active choice to do evil, but a passive choice to avoid confrontation, to maintain comfort, to preserve the status quo. And by the time the consequences of that passivity become clear, it's too late to undo the damage. The Thornwell case is a case study in complicity on multiple levels. The asylum staff who released Samuel without proper verification. The bureaucrats who lost or destroyed records. The community members who may have suspected but didn't speak. The newspaper editors who downplayed the story. The officials who coordinated the cover-up. The historians who let the case fade into obscurity. Each person made what seemed like a small decision, a reasonable decision, but collectively those decisions allowed a tragedy to occur and then ensured it would be forgotten. And we, today, are complicit too when we treat stories like this as entertainment rather than education, when we focus on the sensational details rather than the systematic failures, when we shake our heads at the horror of the past without examining how similar horrors might be happening in the present. I don't tell this story to shock you, though I know it does. I tell it because stories like this matter. They matter because they reveal truths about human nature, about social structures, about the ways that good intentions can lead to terrible outcomes and how silence can be more dangerous than speech. The case of Margaret and Samuel Thornwell is not just a historical curiosity. It's a warning about what happens when we prioritize institutions over individuals, reputation over truth, and comfort over justice. It's a reminder that the most dangerous monsters are not the ones we imagine in nightmares but the ones we create through our collective failures of compassion, oversight, and courage. If you're watching this from New York or London or Los Angeles or anywhere else in the world, I want you to think about your own community. Think about the systems that are supposed to protect people. Think about the individuals who fall through cracks. Think about the truths that are uncomfortable to confront. Because Thornwell Hollow wasn't unique. It was just unlucky enough to have its darkness exposed. Every community has its Thornwell Hollow, its hidden place where things happen that don't fit the official narrative. And every era has its Margaret and Samuel, people whose suffering is made worse by the inadequacy of our systems and the convenience of our amnesia. So what do we do with this knowledge? How do we honor the memory of people like Margaret Thornwell, who suffered not just tragedy but the added cruelty of being erased from history? We tell their stories. We refuse to let the silence stand. We examine uncomfortable truths even when examining them makes us complicit in the knowledge of them. We build better systems, fight for better mental health care, insist on accountability and transparency in our institutions. We resist the urge to look away from suffering because looking away is easier than acting. And we remember. We remember that behind every scandalous headline, every whispered rumor, every case file that mysteriously disappears, there are real people whose lives matter, whose pain deserves acknowledgement, whose stories deserve to be told with honesty and compassion. Margaret Thornwell died alone, broken, and erased from history. Her son died locked in a cell, his humanity stripped away by years of abuse. Thornwell Hollow died as a community, scattered to the winds, reclaimed by the forest. But their story survives, and in surviving, it demands something from us. It demands that we be better, do better, and refuse to let convenience triumph over truth. Before we close, I want to return to something I mentioned earlier, those fresh flowers on Margaret's grave. I've thought about them often since that day in the cemetery. Who left them? And why? After the video I made about my visit to the cemetery aired on the Truth Fear, I received an email from a woman in Atlanta. She claimed to be a descendant of Margaret's younger sister, a woman I hadn't mentioned in my coverage because she played no role in the central tragedy. This sister, whose name was Catherine, had married and moved away from Thornwell Hollow in the 1870s, before the worst of the scandal occurred. The woman who emailed me, who I'll call Jennifer to protect her privacy, said that her family had maintained a tradition of visiting Margaret's grave once a year, leaving flowers, and saying a prayer for a woman they viewed not as a perpetrator of sin but as a victim of unimaginable cruelty. The tradition had been passed down through 5 generations, she said, along with the story of what really happened. Jennifer's version of the story included details that don't appear in any official record. She claimed that Margaret had tried to have Samuel released from the asylum several times over the years, that she had saved money and written letters and begged officials to let her son come home. But the asylum, having committed Samuel to their care, refused to release him to his mother, claiming she was unfit to manage his care. According to Jennifer's family history, this refusal haunted Margaret, contributed to her isolation and depression. She believed she had abandoned her son, and that guilt gnawed at her for 14 years. So when James Goodwin appeared, kind and attentive and needing nothing from her but companionship, Margaret saw it as a sort of redemption. She couldn't save her son, but she could save herself from loneliness, could prove that she was capable of maintaining a normal relationship, could show the world and herself that she wasn't the failed mother that everyone believed her to be. This context, if accurate, adds tragic irony to the story. Margaret married James Goodwin in part to prove she wasn't defined by her failure with Samuel, not knowing that James was Samuel, that her attempt to move beyond that failure was actually bringing her face to face with it in the most horrible way imaginable. Jennifer also shared something else. Her family believed that Samuel had not meant to hurt his mother, not consciously. They believed he had been so damaged by his time in the asylum, so disconnected from normal understanding of relationships, that he genuinely thought coming home and marrying his mother was a way to fix what had been broken. In his fractured mind, marriage meant family, meant belonging, meant being safe and loved. He didn't have the psychological tools to understand why what he was doing was wrong. Is this interpretation correct? I don't know. It's gentler than some other interpretations, more inclined to see Samuel as victim than perpetrator. But it's also consistent with what we know about severe psychological trauma and its effects on understanding social relationships and boundaries. Jennifer asked me to include this perspective in any future discussions of the case, to complicate the narrative of monster and victim, to acknowledge that sometimes people do terrible things not out of malice but out of a brokenness so profound that they can no longer distinguish right from wrong. I agreed to share her perspective because I think it's important. Not because it excuses what happened, but because it helps us understand how it could happen. And understanding, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it complicates our moral judgments, is how we prevent similar tragedies in the future. The Thornwell case resists simple categorization. It is horror story and Greek tragedy and social critique all at once. It is about individual suffering and systematic failure. It is about mental illness and poverty and isolation and the inadequacy of human systems to deal with the messy reality of human lives. Most of all, it's about truth and our complicated relationship with it. We want truth, but we want it sanitized, comfortable, fitting into narratives we already understand. When truth comes at us raw and jagged and refusing to fit our categories, we often choose to look away, to forget, to pretend it never happened. But truth doesn't go away just because we stop looking at it. It lingers in cemetery plots overgrown with weeds, in archives hidden in university basements, in family stories passed down through generations, in the collective memory of places that no longer exist. And eventually, if we're lucky or unlucky depending on your perspective, that truth emerges again, demanding to be acknowledged. The truth about Margaret and Samuel Thornwell emerged from obscurity in 1967, was suppressed again, and has emerged multiple times since, each time finding a new audience, each time forcing us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, mercy, culpability, and the nature of evil itself. I'm sharing it with you today not because I have answers to those questions, but because I believe the questions matter. I believe that wrestling with moral complexity, refusing easy judgments, and maintaining compassion even in the face of horror are essential human practices. And I believe that remembering stories like this, however painful, is an act of resistance against the forces that would prefer we forget anything that doesn't fit their comfortable narratives. So as we come to the end of this investigation, I want to thank you for staying with me through this dark journey. I know it hasn't been easy. Stories like this take something from us, leave us changed in ways we can't always articulate. But they also give us something, wisdom, perspective, and the knowledge that we are capable of facing difficult truths without looking away. If you found this video valuable, if you believe in the importance of remembering forgotten stories and examining uncomfortable truths, I need you to do something for me. Subscribe to The Truth Fear if you haven't already. Hit that notification bell so you're alerted when we release new investigations. Share this video with someone you think can handle it, someone who values truth over comfort. And leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what this story means to you. Your engagement with this content is what allows me to continue doing this work. Every subscription, every share, every comment is a vote for the importance of historical truth, for the value of remembering those who have been forgotten, for the necessity of confronting darkness rather than pretending it doesn't exist. This is The Truth Fear, and we're building something important here. We're creating a space where difficult histories can be examined honestly, where moral complexity is embraced rather than simplified, where the forgotten are remembered and the silenced are given voice. But I can't do it alone. I need you with me, supporting this channel, engaging with this content, spreading these stories to audiences who might not otherwise encounter them. The case of Margaret and Samuel Thornwell deserves to be remembered not as a scandalous curiosity but as a profound tragedy that reveals fundamental truths about human nature and social systems. It deserves to be studied, discussed, and used as a catalyst for building better systems of mental health care, better protections for vulnerable individuals, and better mechanisms for accountability in our institutions. But all of that starts with remembering, with refusing to let this story fade back into obscurity, with insisting that Margaret's suffering and Samuel's destruction mean something beyond just fodder for dark entertainment. So subscribe, share, comment, engage. Be part of this community that refuses to look away from difficult truths. Together, we can ensure that stories like this are never forgotten again, that the lessons they teach are learned and applied, that the people who suffered in obscurity are finally given the acknowledgement they deserve. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being willing to sit with discomfort and confront darkness. That willingness is what makes you part of the Truth Fear community, and it's what gives me hope that we can build a world where tragedies like Thornwell are less likely to occur and less likely to be swept under the rug when they do. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and remember, the truth may be fearful, but forgetting is far more dangerous. This is the truth fear. And this was the hidden case of the widow who married her own son. The darkness of 1893 still echoes today. Remember Margaret. Remember Samuel. Remember Thornwell Hollow. And never stop seeking the truth, no matter where it leads.